Welcome to ShovelTalk, a podcast for economic developers. From your friends at the Golden Shovel Agency.
Welcome back, Shovelheads, to another episode of ShovelTalk. I am your host, Darren Barley. Dovetailing off of our recent webinar, Succession Planning for Economic Development Leaders, which I hope you all attended, Bethany Quinn is going to chat with Michael Darger from the University of Minnesota from the Department of Community Development. During this discussion, Michael will be sharing some of his research on what business owners care about when making transitions and how economic developers can provide support during this process. Michael and Bethany, the stage is yours.
Hello, everyone. I am Bethany Quinn, Executive Vice President of Golden Shovel Agency, and I'm very excited to be here today with Michael Darger, who is with the University of Minnesota Extension. Michael, I want to say hello to you and welcome you because you actually are going to be such an interesting guest for me today because you have conducted original research that I can't wait to discuss. It's very exciting. But for those who don't know, Michael, you have been with Minnesota Extension for over 21 years. That's a long time.
Yeah, I've been at the University of Minnesota for 25. So this is round up and call it a quarter century of business retention and expansion. And in the last 3 years, business succession and transition.
Yeah, University of Minnesota all the way.
Yes.
I love it.
But I did not start here. I came from after a career in economic development. I'd worked for an ex-urban county and two kind of central city community development corporation jobs. So I got a taste of the industry, and I had been in corporate America before that. So I came to the U at 39, and hopefully had learned something that was useful before I got here.
Yeah, I would imagine. No, I think that's fantastic that you have experience in the corporate space and as an economic developer as well. Just for everyone listening, that really can help to inform our conversation around succession planning. I was interested specifically in what got you interested in this work, because succession planning that's such a unique niche, right?
Right. Well, I've been the business retention and expansion kind of lead for U of M Extension, like I said, for 25 years. And, retaining businesses, business succession transition, retiring business owners, or people who aren't retiring. They just want to quit being the leader owner of a business and they want to do something else, whether it's another business or they made it big and they want to, retire early, or something happened to them, so they need to switch gears. So this is a related, BST, I use business succession transition for my favorite acronym, BST, and it's very related and overlapping with BRE, but also with entrepreneurship and, kind of existing business economic development. So it's, we've been at it for about a decade, and I'm the fourth person on our team who's been attempting to learn, research, and educate about this.
Now, I want to have you elaborate a little bit more on your favorite acronym of BST, because it is different than what people normally say.
Right.
Tell me why.
Yeah. My colleague, John Keimig at the Family Business Center here in Minnesota, he says, succession is pretty much the process of preparing for all of this stuff you got to transfer, right? The knowledge, the customers, the vendors, the employees, all of the assets. But the transition, that's more of an event. That's like a legal switch. Now, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And so business owners need to know, listen, it's not like you wake up one day and you're the owner and the big leader, and the next day you're nothing. I mean, it can be, things can transfer, kind of, ramp down. There's different ways, and that's actually preferable. But yeah, BST kind of acknowledges the fact that it's a process, succession, and an event transition.
I like that. So succession is the process of how we get to the event. We can't forget about the actual event either. You have to plan for both.
Right. So I'll use this by the same token, I'll use the words owner and leader. So the ownership of a firm, that's the legal stuff and all that, but that person doesn't necessarily have to be the leader. But in really small businesses, it usually is. But so those are separable things too, the ownership and the leadership. And you need to, the ownership you could think is more about the transition, the legal ownership, whereas the succession of leaders is the process of transferring the knowledge and what makes it so that people want to, use that company as a customer or whatever, work there,
Yeah, absolutely. And that's interesting you bring that up because I was reading something last week that was talking about how sometimes owners are afraid to transition their company because they may not be able to determine who that leader is. So being able to distinguish that it
Yes.
doesn't necessarily have to be the same person. There could be a new owner, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that is who is going to be leading the company, I think is an interesting component.
Right. And, depending on which model of future ownership leadership. So for instance, if you transfer it to the employees through one of the employee ownership models, people might assume, well, then everyone's the boss. But no, not generally, unless you sold it to like a collective where there is no boss. And, that's very few businesses would do that. There's still going to be a manager. And so even selling to the employees, and I'm talking about the rank and file employees. I'm not talking about, the daughter of the owner who now is, no longer an employee, but she's the boss, or like the partners or any of the other, let's call them like existing leaders, partners, family members, or managers. But just selling to the employees rank and file, you still have to have a leader, still have to have a leadership structure, the management. So.
Yeah, and I think that can make business owners more comfortable sometimes, especially when you talk about employee ownership, knowing that they still are able to identify a leader. And like you said, it's not just going to be everyone in the company vying for who gets to say what direction the company is going to go.
And I think the real essence of your question, Bethany, is that the leader really matters and the leadership really matters. And so we can understand why owners are reluctant. They have a strong sense of self-efficacy or, their ability to do the job and to be that leader, that person out in front, and to, that's not just for everyone, both in terms of attitudes and skills that the successors, the people who take over leadership have to have is something that has to be developed. So that's why succession's a process. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that I wanted to dive into today is the research that you've done to actually engage with business owners to determine if they're ready for that process to begin and maybe what is motivating them to start that process, kind of going back to the very beginning. So could you tell us a little bit more about your research, how you conducted it, and what some of those findings were?
You bet. I have a predecessor, retired educator, Liz Templin, and she did a bunch of research about 7 years ago for Minnesota Extension. And she found out, she was kind of looking out the rearview mirror of, what it took to successfully transfer some rural businesses in some pretty rural places in Minnesota and North Dakota. And she found some really interesting stuff. What I want to do with this current research, Bethany, is I want to kind of get inside both the hearts and the heads of the existing owners. So we used, we bought a database. Well, but before I get into the weeds, you're talking about why did I do it and what was I trying to discover? So I wanted to learn about basically the readiness, their awareness of various options, their awareness of resources, their awareness that they're not going to live forever or whatever, that they have to make these plans. But
it'll
also
happen
their
eventually.
Attitudes. Yeah, their attitudes about what matters to them, in terms of what do they care about and what do they think about various options for transferring, and kind of what are their aspirations. So a little bit of kind of the stuff that is emotional as well as kind of like intellectual, and there's a lot of overlap there. But this is the thing that's a business that's a separate thing from you, and if it's not, then that's a problem. That's not a transferable thing if you have to go with the business forever.
Sure.
But also there's this whole issue of personal readiness, which gets into emotional readiness and emotional intelligence and all that good stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that you were looking into that because the having had the benefit of reading some of your research, I think the mistake that some people make is thinking that it's a purely financial decision. And the fact that you were investigating personal readiness and what their aspirations and motivations were really highlights the fact that as a business owner, it's a very human decision. And finance is not always the biggest motivator.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And why do we get stuck? We can get stuck because we're afraid or because we're worried about things that concern us. And so we did definitely want to look at, we call them factors. Well, we definitely are asking them about what they cared about, both in terms of the business's success, their own financial success, and such things as retaining employees, retaining the business and the community. It's up to them to decide what their values are, but we were just trying to kind of, get into that a little bit because motivation matters. And if you're thinking about what do you care about, that can help kind of crack open this topic. If you really do care about, for instance, that the business lasts a long time, okay, then that's going to maybe motivate how you try to do succession and transition, as opposed to like maybe you really care about what happens to the employees, and that might mean you go in a slightly different direction.
And what did you find are the top motivators for people looking to transition?
Well, I can't say that I found the top motivators because, we haven't done any kind of we did a snapshot in time, whereas, we think we found some pretty good information. But so, for instance, what do they care about? We asked this question in two ways. And the first way we asked it was kind of what, on a 6-point scale, how would you rate these 10 different factors? And what we found was that there was about 3 factors or values that were not about their personal financial situation. The personal financial situation was like the 4th highest thing. And so business financial success got a 5.2. That was the highest score on the 6-point scale, with 6 being to a great extent. And then retaining good jobs for employees and businesses longevity, those both got 5.1 and 5.0. And then their wealth, personal financial situation, got a 4.7. Now we asked the question a different way. The very next question was, okay, what is the first most important thing? What's the second? We asked them to rank them. And in that question, the personal financial situation, not surprisingly, rose to the top. However, the business's financial success was just basically about the same. They were 1/10 of a point apart, but more people ranked the business's financial success than the people who said personal financial success, so you could argue which one's the most important, but depending on how you ask the question, both it's a false choice, because the owner needs to be able to take care of themselves and their family as they move away from the business. On the other hand, there's other things they care about, because they, especially if they're first or second generation, they built this business, right? They care about it. So,
yeah, it seems to me that legacy is really what it comes down to. What legacy am I leaving with my business? And if you're talking about financial success after transition, that's obviously the ability to sustain your legacy with your employees and the jobs you created, the longevity. It all just seems like it's feeding into that same very core concept.
Yeah. So, legacy items could be the business's success over time, keeping jobs for employees, keeping the business in the community or in the family. And all of those things got around a 2 on average on that second question, whereas the personal financial situation and the business's financial success, those are the ones that were slightly ahead at 1.6 and 1.7. But there's a whole bunch of legacy issues there, and they're separable issues. We found that the people who really cared about keeping the business and the family, that really rose up. But then most of the businesses didn't care as much about that. So the values would shift based on if they cared about one thing, they might care more or less about some other things.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think economic developers can take from that the importance of having conversations with local business owners.
Right.
Yes, instead of assuming what they're really motivated by or what they really care about in a transition, it's important to ask and find out.
I'm glad you said that, and maybe you're about to ask me, but But the good news in terms of their activities, Bethany, was that, I mean, there's some bad news in this survey, but the good news is that these almost 300 owners were having discussions inside the business, over 2/3, and over 4/5 of them were having discussions with their family members. Now, there's some less good news, but those, to hit on your point, discussing
Sure.
this is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with economic developers, one of the things that can be a challenge is figuring out how to become part of those conversations. I know I've conducted some interviews recently with economic developers who have made this a top priority. And one of the common refrains I hear is that business owners are sometimes afraid to have the conversation because they're worried people will find out. And if people
Yeah,
find out they're
absolutely.
considering it, it might hurt their business before they're ready to transition. So
Yep.
what do you recommend? Because you got all these people to open up to you. So what should they do?
And they were not talking to me. They were in the privacy of their office or their home. They were filling out this paper survey. But we're so thankful that these owners and leaders did this. And to me, it tells me that this is an important issue to the business community. So in the privacy of their own space, and we can tell it's pretty good data because they filled out the entire survey. There wasn't any drop off. Now we designed a good survey and all that. It was only supposed to take about 10 or 12 minutes. So we find that there was really consistent. So we feel like this is reliable and valid data. But yeah, confidentiality is a huge issue with respect to business succession transition. It always has been. It probably always will be. But one of my former colleagues, she's one of the people who ran this program before me. And Jennifer Hawkins, she would say, listen, economic development officer, this is an issue you need to care about, and you need to be able to bring this up. Why can't we bring this up in the community? Now, you don't want to put any business owner on the spot in a public meeting. However, this is something economic developers wearing their BRE hat. And I remember Jeff Finkel at the International Economic Development Council saying 15 years ago at one of his meetings here with our state association in Minnesota, he says, BRE is the meat and potatoes of economic developers. I still think that's true. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm the BRE, official for extension here. But, bringing this up in different ways. And so one way that I think economic developers can bring it up is in the privacy of a BRE visit, right? Any kind of,
Definitely.
you probably don't want to do this when you're at the Rotary or the EDA meeting or some other kind of thing where there's people listening in. But in those one-on-ones or those two-on-one visits at the business owner's place, that's a very appropriate. In fact, I would say it's part of the duty of an economic developer to bring this up because it's got a signaling and educational value for the owner, but it's also important for the community, obviously, like you said. So that's in fact where we came across this issue. We were finding in our BRE visits, we've helped Minnesota communities do BRE for a long time, and we were finding that very few business owners of these small businesses would say they had written business plans, and even fewer of them, and this goes back 10, 12 years, were having written business success and transition plans. So, there's a gal, Amy Schaefer, who's a small town economic developer in Minnesota in Blue Earth. And I've got a couple of videos by her on my YouTube channel about BST. And she just builds it in every BRE visit. And they also have a policy for all their economic development programs that you need to have a written BST plan for any business that wants to apply for some of their, their public ED resources.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. And definitely including this in the set of questions that are asked during BRE visits is incredibly important. Creating that space for a confidential conversation is also important, knowing that business owners are probably not going to be likely to share if a manager or other team member is there.
Yeah.
So making sure that those are one-on-one conversations, I think, is helpful. I'm wondering how well and this is just conjecture on your part, but I'm wondering how well a survey would do at the local community level. Since you did mention, obviously, people sat in the comfort of their office and then they were willing to fill it out for you. I wonder, hypothetically, if that might be something economic developers could do just in their own communities.
I've never actually thought of that per se, but this is a very much like, you could say that this is a topical a topical BRE issue. It's like, let's pick BST as the BRE issue this year or something. Yeah, they could do a survey. They could take our University of Minnesota survey and knock themselves out. We have the actual raw survey on our website. We have the raw survey with the actual results. You can't tell which business said which, but we have all of the stuff we found out. We've got several articles and everything. But yes, like this survey we think wasn't perfect. It was pretty good. You could take a subset of this survey. I think there's some questions that are more valuable than others, but I think that's a great idea. And so I created this YouTube channel. They're all like 2, 3, 4 minute little snippets about BST. And John Keimig has this, one of my favorite clips is sometimes you got to poke the bear and you have to bring this topic up. But one way of bringing this topic up is to send out a decent survey and get people to think about it, and then have some information about, for more information, here's who you can follow up with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just for anyone listening, the reason why that might be something to consider is, for one, as Michael said, the survey is available online. You could use it and it would not cost you anything to develop your own. Thank you for giving that resource to the public. That's great. The second is, I've spoken with so many of you. I know that your resources are limited and it's really hard for you to reach all the businesses in your community, if not impossible. We have these conversations constantly, right? So it's very common to me, pick your top 50 or top 100, but that's just not reaching everyone. So this would help you potentially to engage with more businesses. Yeah.
And, Minnesota is, we're in the Great White North and all that good stuff. We're, the North Star state. But, I don't think our businesses are really that much different than in Maryland or Washington or, they're just, there's a lot of opportunity to compare. So, for instance, let's say, a little community in Maryland or in Missouri where you used to live, they want to do some version of our survey or some of the benchmark questions. They could actually look at the results and compare their businesses to what these 2023 year, Minnesota businesses, and these businesses were, between 5 and 250 employees. It's interesting. We went up to 500 employees. It was a scientific sample, so we had the right, proportion of businesses with between 250 and 500. Not a single one of those businesses filled this out. To me, I don't think that means that they had gatekeepers or they don't do University of Minnesota surveys. University of Minnesota surveys. I think that means that at a certain strata, those owners probably have this figured out. It's to get to us to not that they're perfect, but I think so. What we have is some on our website as well, Bethany, is we've got the raw data, but you can actually do data dashboards. And so there's a whole bunch of things that allow people to look at, the values questions, the personal and the business readiness questions, what types of advisors were they using? And you can look at different NAICS codes and different industry codes. And again, we don't let anyone figure out who said what. We're super careful, obviously. But you can actually drill down to regions of Minnesota. You can look at, there's various ways you can say, I want to see what hospitality businesses said. And there might only be 12. Because we did basically all the NAICS codes except for farmers and for-profit educators. All the other, industry codes were in there. So
that's actually really
interesting. Penetrate the data and kind of, think about this.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I've dug through the website. I missed that. So I'm glad you told me that. I'm going to go and dig there even more now.
I am very proud of that website, and it's very robust and not 1, 2, it was like 3 I had 4 students and I had PhD colleagues, professors. I had all sorts of people help me, but a young colleague, she's a 20-something, she says, okay, these long BRE and other reports, can we think about fewer of these long narration reports and do more things like data dashboards? And that was just less than a year ago. I'm like, what's a data dashboard? And so I went to my students. I said, can you do data dashboards with our really cool data source? And they said, heck yeah, just let us add it. And they figured out Tableau, which is the software. And now I have 5 or 6 of these dashboards, and they're kind of fun.
That's awesome. Well, that's why you need a diverse team, because it makes our ideas better.
Exactly. It's easier I mean, I'm an old guy and I can learn new tricks, but you might as well just work with some of the students who want to learn those new tricks anyways, and they're going to be able to use them in their careers. And I think about kind of the strategic issues, like, how can we help Minnesota? We're still trying to figure out the class or the course, Bethany. So we have had this course where it's like 5, 6, 7 weeks online in Zoom, and it's hard for us to get the business owners in the seats. And I don't know if that's because a course is just a stupid idea. I don't think so. I think for some people, courses help them, even if it's just like a little 2-session course where you go work with your spouse and figure out your wills. I'm going to do that with my wife next month. Like, okay, sometimes a class helps you move forward. But, it could be that the dashboard on the industry codes will give us some insights about how to do the marketing and promotion or the content for a course, because different industries and different groups of businesses care about slightly. This is all, not big changes, but they can give you some insights.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it will influence how you tailor your messages to them, which is something that we really focus on at Golden Shovel, because a lot of our work involves outreach to target industries. And so that's something that we realize. You have to speak to people differently based on their pain points and their priorities. So that makes a lot of sense, which is why I want to dig around into your data dashboard. But one of the other things that I did want to cover is you asked questions about where businesses were going to have these conversations. Basically, who are those trusted resources? And obviously, I think this is important for economic developers to realize, because again, if you can't be everywhere, you could at least try to build up your network to make sure your network is the same as theirs. So what did you learn?
Well, the biggest thing is not a surprise, is that there's a real cut point between public sector or let's say private nonprofit, like the economic development community, and then those of us in places like University of Minnesota Extension, which is a public research university. Business owners are not thinking about these individuals for where to get information. They think about some of the more what you would expect. So for instance, accountants were number one, like with about 59%. Other business owners were their second source of information. So their buddies, their business buddies. Then attorneys were right around 50%. Then their spouse. I would not have thought about asking about the spouse, but because a former BST survey from the BEI group out of Denver had asked, I'm like, okay, said to my student, we're going to ask about the spouse/partner. That was 4th highest. And then personal financial planner was 5th. Now, okay, extension and universities, we came in at less than 1% of the business owners turn to organizations like ours. And then at small business development centers and a whole bunch of people were under 20% or even under 10% in the ecosystem. So, and what we found, if you look at the article I did with the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development in their Minnesota Economic Trends, and that's posted at our research site, what we found was, going back to those 2 questions about personal readiness and business readiness, my students who are statistics majors, as it turns out, they found that on a statistically significant basis that the business readiness was increased by almost half a point on that 6-point scale if they talked to their accountant, another half a point if they talked to their accountant, more than half a point if they conferred with their spouse/partner. And then if you add all 3 together, the cumulative effect made their readiness the business readiness, not the personal. So the business readiness went from a 3.22 to over a 4.6, which means that they moved from less than the midpoint to almost ready, because it's closer to a 5 than a 4 on the 6-point scale. And so this kind of okay, that's not news that accountants and attorneys are important. And it makes sense intuitively about your life partner. But it's kind of the whole thing is that it takes a village, right? There's no one advisor who is sufficient. They're all important. And there's a whole slew of other advisors, depending on your situation, that you may need. Like a person who gives the financial valuation of your business, and that personal financial, the banker, someone who's going to finance, a whole slew.
Mm-hmm.
The ecosystem's full of important players. But what my predecessor, Liz Templin, had found in that study of successful transitions was that they needed anywhere from 3 to 5 advisors, and the average was close to 4. So, and my research kind of backs that up.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean all at the same time, or they're all like a team, although there's maybe some advantages to that. But at certain points during the process, you're going to need help from a handful or more of advisors.
So I think just knowing our audience of who's listening, one of the things that you could take away from that is that if a business is speaking with their accountant and their attorney, either or, about this possibility, that does not mean that you aren't needed.
Right.
You can still add value and become one of those 4, potentially.
Yeah, and I think the value for an economic or community development or chamber official, someone who maybe they're good at doing a deal. Maybe they've got that financial spreadsheeting. Maybe they're a CPA or attorney. There's a few people like that in our occupation. But even if they don't have those technical assistant skills, their role is to say, your business matters to this community and to your employees and to your customers and to your vendors and to the city, the county. If that helps you know that it's not just about you, it's about this valuable thing called a business. And, especially in rural places, Bethany, once a certain kind of business is gone, that community is fairly likely to never have that type of business again, because we're in this era of Amazon and, all the stuff you can get from ginormous places. But, what's the value of that business as a gathering spot, as a place that, that they know you, they know your kids, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do hear that quite a lot in regards to just frustrations economic developers have, is that sometimes they don't find out until it's too late.
Sure.
And don't have that opportunity to express, how important the business is and really try to help make sure that it maintains in the community. So one of the things that I'm hoping that you can help us with is knowing how economic developers could maybe identify, is there a data source, businesses who might be more likely to be approaching transitions? They want to try to get a list and maybe, pick out that percentage of the community they're going to focus on this year. How would they do that?
The age of business owners, I think, is a bit of a black hole. And I think the federal government hasn't done, that age thing hasn't been, for whatever reason, it's either suppressed or they don't gather that information. So there's a lot of information about business establishments. So for instance, I worked with Cameron Mocht, who's the lead regional data analyst for our state agency. And he's the one who helped me get to that, basically verify the data from Project Equity and that nice little visual that they do across the United States. And in our state, Project Equity allows you to drill down to most of the counties and see what percentage, and it's usually right around 50%, are owned by 55 plus. Now, they can't and don't tell you who those businesses are, but they give you the distribution of the NAICS codes. So county by county, what the distribution of businesses by industry. But I think that's going to be more of using your senses, right? Using who and what your direct primary, I call that primary data. To what extent does your economic development organization have, reconnaissance, have intelligence gathering about that demographic fact? How old are your business owners? And in my case, you could look at me and tell me, and most people can tell I'm north of 55. I'm actually well past 60, but the color of the hair, not the lack of hair, will tell them, okay, this guy, if I was a business owner,
maybe he's older and getting close to retirement.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I actually did meet with the Project Equity folks, and they have so many valuable resources. I asked them the same question, and they also said they were not able to identify, using any type of data source, which business in particular was owned by someone who was nearing retirement age. But they recommended looking at when the business was established, which of course can help in some cases, but you don't know if the business has transitioned
You bet.
previously
Yeah.
using that data alone.
Yeah, that's just a hole in the data. But in Minnesota, Cameron, when he helped me write this, I was so grateful to him because he got my first publication, but it's really useful for them too, because, employment trends. But what they found was that the Minnesota businesses tended to be older than American businesses. I don't know what that means, but for instance, 41% of our employer businesses, so these aren't 1099, these aren't just self-employed, but people who have employees. We had 41% that were 16 or more years old, whereas the American average was about 33%. I don't know what that means. Yeah. But yeah, I think that this points back to quality BRE, programming and gathering your own data. I mean, there's so much good data out there from what I call secondary sources, but there's nothing replaces you having your own primary data, your own data collection that you can trust. And it gives, I have a class in the BRE class. I'm sorry, I have a question in the BRE class that we teach, Bethany. And it's like, what's more important, economic developer, relationships or data about businesses? And it's a trick question, but it's ponderable, right? Because they're both important. And how do you get one without the other?
Right. Well, if you have the relationship, maybe it's easier to get the data, which is exactly what you're encouraging people to do.
Yeah.
Now, switching gears a little bit outside of your research, one of the things I know that you advocate for is when business owners do decide to transition, to consider going to an employee-owned model. And I was hoping that you could tell our listeners a little bit more about that, just because it's not something that's very common everywhere.
You bet. And part of this goes to my values as I'm a longtime member of the REI co-op and several other co-ops. So this notion of cooperation is something that I value. It's been part of my life for most of my life. So, there's such a thing as worker cooperatives. I mean, most of the co-ops we think about are like, for instance, the REI co-op, where you can be a member, but basically you go to the store and you buy all your camping and boating stuff and you're a happy customer, but you might happen to be a consumer member, owner. But with worker co-ops, this is where, the rank and file workers own the business. And these are kind of emerging. There's a few of them around the United States. And so that's an example of something where there's more democracy in the workplace. Now, co-ops are not for everybody because co-ops move slow. I like to say they move at the speed of trust. But, cooperatives are one form of shared ownership and kind of distributing the ownership beyond, one or a handful of people. And so, the research, and I'll hold up the book because you asked I'm sorry. There's a book by Corey Rosen, who's one of the kind of leading figures in the employee ownership movement. And he cites the research about how both companies and employees tend to perform better when there's broad-based ownership by the employees. And there's several forms: co-ops, ESOPs, employee ownership trusts, employee stock purchase plans of various stripes. There's even some private equity firms that are getting into more employee ownership as a percentage of the deal, and yet it's still private equity. So there's all these hybrids and stuff out there. But as the BRE lead for Minnesota Extension, it's kind of my working hypothesis, Bethany, that one is that, like I said before, if you lose a rural business, you lose a business from a small town or a underserved community of whatever stripe, you're not likely to get a replacement for that business. So playing defense, doing BRE well is always a good strategy. And my hunch is that to keep a business local, which is what BRE is about, it's more likely to happen if the ownership of that business is more broadly based and more local than not. And so that's kind of a hypothesis I can't prove, but I just think that, for instance, if Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or Racine, Wisconsin were trying to lure away one of our Minnesota firms, And if there was 7 or 17 owners of that firm in, let's say, Waseca, Minnesota, as opposed to 1 or 2 owners, I just think that the stakes, it's just going to be harder to get that kind of agreement for that business attraction to happen.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think on one of the articles that you wrote, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned some research that was done by Rutgers. So obviously a New Jersey educational institution, so across the country, on this same topic. And I believe that they had referenced that as well, is that it has the potential to keep ownership local long term.
Yeah, it really crosses over with the whole local movement and a lot of food co-ops and the whole like local food scene. There's a lot of crossover effect, but the values, again, the values of local participation, local inclusion, and local kind of just more connections. So the ownership of small business can be part of that kind of local movement, you know.
Yeah. And I do think it's really an important factor for economic developers to consider, because it can be challenging to find the one individual who is able or interested in purchasing a business completely by themselves, where employees already work for the company. They already live in your community. And so the opportunity to make that transition, yes, there's hurdles like there is with everything. But at least you already have the potential owners identified, which is overcoming one of the significant hurdles right away.
Right. And they have a vested interest.
Correct. Yeah.
Now,
their jobs, their livelihoods.
Yeah. I mean, like we talked about before, that doesn't, just because of employee ownership doesn't mean everyone's the boss, or that the whole management the management structure has to change. In fact, most of the time it stays intact. When there's a conversion from, let's call it a traditional ownership, an LLC, 1 or 2 or 3 owners, to a more broader employee ownership situation. So, with EO, employee ownership, for instance, with cooperatives, you don't have to become one of the owners. You can be an employee who just keeps your job. So it doesn't, ownership's not for everybody, because ownership has all this, responsibilities and duties and stuff. So, there's all sorts of versions of this. It's actually kind of complex, but there's a whole ecosystem out there of groups that are. Rutgers is the leading research institutions of public universities, but there's this National Center for Employee Ownership, and there's also Project Equities. There's just a whole ecosystem of people, and there's people studying this all over the world. And Corey Rosen jokes that there's been more academic studies of worker cooperatives than there's maybe worker cooperatives, which is a little waggy. ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, are probably the more prevalent, employee ownership form, but that doesn't work for every company. So you need a variety of solutions.
Sure. No, that's great. And it's always good to expand our tool chest as far as what solutions we can offer. So, Michael, I did not warn you for this, but we've reached a point in the podcast recording where we are going to play a game, and it has absolutely nothing to do with our conversation.
All right.
And I did not prep you for this, so you don't know what I'm going to ask. But I am going to play this game with you called Shovel Toss, and I am pulling up my stopwatch here because the objective is for me to ask you questions, 10 questions, random questions, and see how quickly you can answer them. So you gotta take off your academic hat and just say whatever comes to mind, okay? Are you ready?
Like, do you want 1 or 2 words, or is there a rule of thumb?
Whatever comes to mind.
Okay.
But you're trying to be as fast as you can. That's the objective of the game. Okay, ready? Start. First car.
Datsun.
Favorite dessert.
Ooh, creme brulee.
If you could be a superhero, who would you be?
Oh boy. Spider-Man or Superman.
Favorite vacation destination?
Oh, now that's impossible. Oh boy, I would have to say anywhere with mountains and mountain lakes and clean and pure air.
Book you are reading right now?
It's got something with happiness. I can't remember the title.
Well, we'll go with the book you already recommended then.
Okay.
Top of your bucket list.
Top of the bucket list?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's tough. In terms of work, I would say trying to get a class for economic developers on this BST topic so I can help empower them. And it'd be great to have lots of Minnesotans, but if there's folks from elsewhere in shovel country, golden shovel country, I would like to make it a resource. That'd
be awesome.
That would be cool. And if it gets connected to things like Golden Shovel or IDC, that would even be better.
Yeah, that would be awesome to get the word out. I love it. Okay, your go-to song.
Oh boy. Wow. What a beautiful
What's your playlist
world.
favorite?
Well, I don't have a playlist, but let's go with What a Beautiful World.
Okay. Something you can't live without.
Being outside.
What you wish you would have known when you started your career.
I wish I had listened to my Uncle Morris. Not what you know, it's who you know. But you know what? You figure that out as you go.
Sure. What you want to be remembered for.
Trying to help people realize the value of the blessings around them. And BRE is one form of that.
That's a good one. All right, you made it.
All right.
Good job.
That's kind of fun.
Good
That's
job.
like Stephen Colbert, like the game that he plays.
Yeah, we just had to go through it, and we learned so much about you this way, right?
Yeah.
Which is a lot of fun for our listeners. And you did all of that in 2 minutes and 17 seconds. So good job. I think if you had remembered the title of your book, you would have been even faster. Well, before you go, I want to give you the opportunity to please tell people how to visit your website where they can find all of this incredible research that you've conducted.
Yeah, I mean, they could go to a couple of ways. They could go to the University of Minnesota Extension and just put in business succession and transition in the search bar. Or if they like these little linky things, they could go Z as in zebra, z.umn.edu/biz succession, BIZ succession. And,
Perfect.
I think I do want to plug the research page. So I would say that same z.umn.edu/BST research.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And we will also provide a link in the description for this podcast if any of you did not have your pen handy. But thank you so much, Michael. We really appreciate you being here with us today. And again, I've found so much value in your research and resources that are online, and I really encourage other people to visit your website so they can access them as well. But thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You're welcome. If you find anything on the data dashboards or any of those other things you want to tell me that whatever, good, bad, or ugly, I'd love to hear.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Bethany.
Thank you, Bethany and Michael. Part 3 of this GSA educational series on succession planning should be arriving in your inbox soon in the form of a white paper. In GSA news, our team just keeps on growing. We have recently added Deanna Morrow as creative project coordinator, Kenna Magistral as social media specialist, Adrian Krisha as gatekeeper technical specialist, and Teresa Joseph as website populator. You can learn more about these folks and the entire team at the GSA website. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon on the next episode of Shovel Talk.